Hi, it's Laura from Firebird Summit. So I've had a very interesting week of conversations, and I kind of wanted to talk about my favorite part of that a little bit today. So the thing that I have spent a surprising amount of the past couple of weeks discussing is the idea of manager as coach, particularly how that applies in technology companies. Now, by no means do I assume that the model is not appropriate in other industries, but as someone who spent 2.5 decades in tech, most of the people that I know and that I work with, and most of my life has been spent in that space. So I have a particular vantage point on where and why I think that the model is especially valuable if you're working in a tech environment. So I want to start by pointing out something that I've mentioned before, and I'll keep coming back to because I think it's going to plague us for quite a while. And that is that most of the models we deal with when it comes to management, both of people and of companies, are very heavily rooted in the management disciplines that arose out of the industrial age and a very factory-oriented mindset. Now, in some ways, those have served us incredibly well. And in others, there are significant shifts that a digital knowledge working employee base and business model really need to take into account. And I talk about this a lot because I'm very passionate about it. And I do feel like it's something that most people are so used to living with that we often underestimate the extent to which things that we do and we consider normal really only made sense if we were talking about that factory model of doing business. And when I say factory model, I don't just mean actual factory work. I mean all of the things that kind of went into that model, which I can go into more detail later. But at the end of the day, I always like to come back to this basic point, which is that we do a lot of things today because that's the way they've always been done. And they were first evolved out of an industrial age business model. Most of us, particularly those of us who live and work in tech, don't work in an industrial age business model anymore. And so in a lot of ways, trying to apply some of those disciplines and some of those methodologies to what we do is fundamentally flawed and ultimately very, very limited. So now to today's point. I often point out that I was extremely lucky in my early career. And yes, I worked hard. Yes, I was working with other really amazing, brilliant, talented people who also worked very hard. But a lot of times when I say that I'm lucky, it was for two really important reasons. The first is that I was enormously fortunate to have phenomenal bosses who were incredibly encouraging and who really, really taught me a lot. And I had the unbelievable good fortune of finding that to be true at multiple points throughout my career. And I am luckier than most in the bosses that I've had. The flip side to my statement on that front is that I started off as a project manager in technology. And this was something that didn't seem like particularly important or relevant choice at the time. It's just sort of the way things happened quite by accident, which is why I do credit luck to some of that. But ultimately what I've discovered is that the skills I had to learn as a project manager have, quite by accident, also evolved into some of the most important managerial skills for the modern business era. So there are really three pieces that I think come up consistently over and over again. And they're things that, as someone who started off as a project manager, I often take for granted as a basic skill set, but that people who came up through other ranks didn't necessarily experience in the same way. So the first one, and often most important, is the importance of influencing. As a project manager, you are almost never directly in authority of the people on your project. You can only find ways to influence them. You never, ever get that much control over them. And so this is a really important thing. And as a 25-year-old doing this for the first time, I had to learn this skill probably before anything else. And so sometimes I'm surprised to discover that people twice my age at the time are still really not sure how to do this. And again, this is something that was completely accidental, but it's incredibly important and is super critical to managing in the modern era. The second piece is related to that. When you're a project manager over a project team, you are invariably responsible for the final deliverables, but all of the individuals who are working on that team are subject matter experts in their own area of expertise. And that is invariably not an area in which you are the expert. So the important piece here is not just that you have to influence them, but you also have to be able to trust them, and they have to be able to trust you. So that trust building element is enormously important, because as a project manager, if your, for instance, database developer says, hey, we have to do it like this, and in order to do that, we need more hardware over here, which means you need to go back to the client and make a request for more budget. I have to trust what I'm being told. Now, in a normal trust but verify kind of way, you do need to collect as much information as possible. But at the end of the day, I was a project manager. I was not someone who could know of my own volition whether or not that was true. I had no choice but to be able to trust the people giving me information in areas where they were expected to be the experts. And finally, I think the last piece about being a project manager that is enormously valuable in the modern era is the idea of something coming to an end and starting over. And ultimately what that created was a situation of turnover. Because as a project manager, you work on a project for maybe 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, maybe even 2 years. But when it's over, you move on to another project. And when that happens, you kind of have to start over. Right? You might get some people on your project a second time who you worked with before, and some of them may have worked with each other before. But a project team comes together, disbands, and then is reformed in a different configuration for the next project. And what this really facilitated for me was recognizing that every time you start over. This is not a one and done. You can't go in and say, great, we communicate effectively as a team, now we're done, and move on. This is a constant exercise, and you constantly have to assume that you're getting a change in the people you're working with, and therefore the dynamics and the relationships that emerge because of it. So those three things, I think, were enormously influential to me as a young project manager. And over time, I found them surfacing again and again as I managed people in different environments, even when I myself had moved out of a project-centric business model, though admittedly I do usually work in project-based environments. So as a result, over the course of my career, I had, before I even knew it was a thing, developed a very coaching-like model. It's a lot more disciplined now, but I really found that coaching as a managerial construct had value in a technology environment that other things didn't have. One of the things that is really important in tech, because you're usually dealing with fairly well compensated people who are in high demand and who can often go off and find another job if they don't like what they're doing for you, is that you have to understand what motivates them. You have to understand what it is that they find interesting, what they hate doing. And while you might not always be able to clear away all the dead wood from their week, when it comes down to it, if you don't actually make an effort to understand what an individual on your team considers truly inspiring, you're going to have a very, very hard time keeping them engaged. And in a tech environment where everybody has a very easy time finding better paying or more interesting job offers, this is a non-negotiable for any manager. Secondly, is really the assumption that experts have to be experts, and you have to treat them like experts. When you contact your accountant or your lawyer and they come back and say, well, I understand your concern, but if you don't do X, Y, and Z, you're opening yourself up to risk. You can't dismiss them. They are an expert in their field, and you're paying them to be an expert. And part of that is also showing them the amount of respect that is due their expertise. Now, obviously, you're still the boss, and you still have to be accountable to what gets done, but taking a command and control approach with experts is not a way for them to feel valuable and to feel like their contribution is being properly respected. And again, in a world where they have other job options, you really want to be careful of that. And finally, I think the best thing that comes out of taking a coaching approach is to expect the unexpected. your team will change. Their career directions will change. Somebody who was an amazing hardware engineer now might decide they want to move into networking. All of those things are evolutionary by their nature. And again, one of the challenges of that sort of factory model is the assumption that there is a very clear linear career path. And that's not true in technology at all. I don't know anybody who's been in tech for more than 10 years and who hasn't changed or evolved or narrowed their focus and their niche simply by virtue of just having learned something new and become interested in something else. To say nothing of the fact that the evolution of technology by itself forces you to constantly have to learn and change where you're focusing. So I would say that the thing that really makes coaching as a model enormously valuable for tech is the fact that as a coach, I don't assume I have all the answers. And as a manager, you probably don't have all the answers. And it's okay to admit that, because you're also establishing a respectful, reciprocal relationship with your team. So one of the last things I want to say on this topic is that, while I do believe very firmly and have for a very long time that coaching is an incredibly powerful and valuable managerial approach in a technology environment, the reality is most people who come from a management perspective do struggle to understand what coaching really looks like. Coaching isn't micromanaging, and it's not direct guidance. And so finding the right balance for your environment where you are holding your people accountable, but you are respecting their autonomy and you are leveraging their expertise while also really helping them figure out how to motivate themselves is enormously integral in this entire process. That's a very difficult skill set. And the truth is, as I continue to harp on, most companies don't really help managers understand how to do that. And that is, again, the source of the conversations I keep having is how, as a company, do we give managers clear enough direction on what's expected of them, but enough support so that they can properly manage their people in a way that keeps everybody engaged and around instead of going off looking for another job. So that's it for this week. I hope you have a fantastic week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.